You say that all of these were young men, that it was a young man's game. And one of the things I was reminded of reading this book, that of course aviation itself hadn't been around for that long. The Wright brothers flew in 1903, so this is really less than 40 years later.
Hmm.
And when you introduce, I'm going to ask you about Curtis LeMay. So many of these young men had a kind of seminal experience, I would say, of of early flight. So tell us who Curtis LeMay was, and how his passion for flying began.
Curtis LeMay is depending on your perspective, either the hero or the villain of the book. The Bomber Mafia were in one corner and Curtis LeMay was in the other. He was their great antagonist, and he thought that they were a group of um, of impractical dreamers and dilettantes who had a series of ridiculous notions about fighting wars that could never be made real. And he was in contrast to the Bomber Mafia, who fancied themselves as intellectuals, men of learning and sophistication, fired by a moral vision. LeMay was like a working class kid from the streets of Columbus, Ohio, who was this kind of ruthless, unsentimental, anti-intellectual. He was all about doing, not about thinking. He did not. I have interviews in the audiobook version of this book. You can hear his voice. The minute you listen to him, you understand him. He's a guy. He's got this kind of grunting, guttural, staccato delivery, and his impatience with people who he feels are not grounded in the real world is perceptible in all these interviews. And LeMay is, as the Bomber Mafia are taking over positions of authority in the Second World War, LeMay is simultaneously making a name for himself in Europe, prosecuting the U.S. half of the air war against Nazi Germany. And he's in another world entirely. He's like rolling his eyes at what the Bomber Mafia is saying. And his belief is, no, you just go in there and you just bomb the bejesus out of your enemy. Anything else is a waste of time. And his ideas come immediately and violently in conflict with people like Haywood Hansel and the Bomber Mafia.
And he replaces. So what's Haywood Hansel's argument, as it were?
Haywood Hansel's argument is we are to the point technologically where we do not need to use bombing in an indiscriminate manner. So he looked at the bombing that was going on by the Germans over London and by the English over Europe with horror. He's like, why are you leveling entire cities? Why are you firebombing Dresden? Why are you trying to defeat the Nazis by reducing Berlin to rubble? And on and on and on. Why are you taking out a cathedral in the middle of some little medieval town in Germany? Why are you doing these things? This made no sense to Haywood Hansel. Hansel said, look, back in the 30s in Montgomery, Alabama, we had all these ideas about how we ought to use technology, and we can make those ideas real now. Let's, instead of bombing the homes of civilians in order to sap their will and defeat our enemy, why don't we just identify the 5 most crucial military targets in that area and take them out? So famously, he launched an attack on a ball bearing factory in a town called Schweinfurt in Bavaria. And Hansel's notion was, look, the Germans make all their ball bearings in Schweinfurt. Ball bearings are central to every single mechanical object used in war. You cannot even build a bicycle without ball bearings. So let's take out their ball bearing manufacturing capacity, and they won't be able to make planes, tanks, jeeps, bicycles, garden carts. I mean, you name it, nothing, right? That's the way Hansel thought. He's like, why are you bombing the home of the hospital or the little old lady down the street or some children's school? No. Just take out the ball bearing factory and they can't make anything. They can't wage war anymore. And so, or he would say, you know, if our big problem is the German Air Force, let's just bomb the factories where they make their planes. Like, don't bother with anything else. Just take out the factories. And he believed you could do that because he had the Norden bomb sight. Because he said, look, I've got the technology to do this.
But then what happened when they actually tried to bomb that factory in Schweinfurt?
Couldn't hit it. That in the real world, trying to use this Norden bomb sight to put a bomb inside a pickle barrel at 20,000 feet is well nigh impossible.
So how was the war going to succeed? That's the other. There are two streams, or more than two streams in this book. But as well as the stream of industrial bombing, there's a chemical side to this book. And one of the things that I was so fascinated to discover is, like so many of your readers, you know, I had heard a great deal about the development of the atomic bomb during the Second World War. I had heard absolutely nothing about the development of napalm, and I hadn't even associated it with the Second World War. So tell us a little bit of that extraordinary story.
Napalm, very early on in the Second World War, the United States are aware that they must defeat Japan in order to win. And they make an observation, many people do, about Japan, which is their cities are quite unlike Western European cities. They are constructed not with wide streets, but with narrow streets. They don't have lots of parks. And most importantly, the homes and buildings are not made of brick. They're made of wood and tar paper. And once you realize that, you realize, oh, we don't have to bomb these cities with conventional explosives. We could just burn them down. They're tinderboxes, right? If you think about if you've ever walked through Berlin, you realize you can't burn down Berlin. One, because everything's stone, but two, because there's these huge wide boulevards and tons of parks which serve as fire breaks. So maybe you can set aside one neighborhood, but then the fire runs up against the, alley, whatever the big street is, and doesn't cross the street. So the fire's contained. That's not what Tokyo was like in 1944. Tokyo was one big undifferentiated urban mass of wooden buildings next to each other, tiny wooden buildings next to each other, and narrow, narrow streets. You light a match in the middle of Tokyo and the whole thing will go up in smoke. So the U.S. military says to the chemists, the prominent chemists of America at the beginning of the war, make me an incendiary bomb that can take out the cities of Japan. And so they go to work and they produce what came to be known as napalm. Napalm was a jellied form of gasoline produced with the explicit purpose of incinerating Japanese cities. And Curtis LeMay is the one who decides, oh, let's actually let's do this. And he takes hundreds of thousands of canisters of napalm and deploys them over Japan in the summer and spring of 1945 and burns 66 cities to the ground, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of lives. If you want to know what's happening in Japan between March of 1945 and July of 1945, before the atomic bombs are dropped in August, what's happening is that every night Japanese civilians are being burnt to death by napalm attacks from the American Air Force.
That actually brings me, we have a question from an audience member, which I will come to, who asks, who says, without getting too much into current politics, do you think the attack on Tokyo would have gone ahead had they known the extent of the damage and the number of deaths? And do you think a similar decision would be made by the USA today if the circumstances were similar?
I think they absolutely knew what the consequences of their attack would be in 1945. In fact, napalm was tested on replica Japanese cities in the Utah desert in the early stages of the war. And they noted with enthusiasm at how quickly and efficiently it could burn down Japanese homes. So nobody was under any illusions that this thing was going to be some kind of minor benign attack. It went exactly as planned. They intended to take out a huge swath of Tokyo, and they were fully prepared for the losses that ensued. 40,000 people that first night. And like I said, probably as many as 1 million over the course of the summer. Could that happen today? I don't think so. I think appropriately our sensitivity to those kinds of losses of human life is just so much greater today. We have arguments about drone strikes that take out 3 people. I mean, I kind of think that American society would shut down if the American government sanctioned a napalm attack that burned down an entire city.
And that in itself, the what you just mentioned, that Japanese sort of replica city built in the Utah desert, that's an extraordinary story, even just the building of that, because it was built, and now his name has escaped me, but an architect who was renowned for his knowledge of Japan.
Yeah, there was a very, very prominent architect, American, who had gone to Japan in the 30s and become, to this day, he's one of the most famous Western architects in Japanese history. And he had come back to America at the outbreak of war. And the Army called him up and said, look, we have this new bomb, this new weapon, napalm, which we think is going to be really useful in destroying Japanese cities. But we need to test that out empirically. Since you know everything about Japanese construction and Japanese architecture, can you design and build for us a little mini Japanese city in the desert, Utah desert? And this guy, he does it with great regrets later, by the way. I mean, he was appalled at what he had to do, but he built a Japanese city in the middle of the desert, and the American bombers came down loaded up with napalm and bombed it, and a group of observers and analysts stood by and made notes to see how long did it take for the whole thing to burn to the ground. And they were deeply satisfied with what they saw, which goes back to my earlier point. This wasn't a surprise to the American military planners, what happened in Tokyo in March of 45. This is exactly what they had planned for.
Why do you think it is that the Manhattan Project is so storied, and the people who developed that terrible weapon are valorized? I think it's fair to say. It's seen as having a hand in certainly in ending the war. But the development of this other weapon, again, one of the extraordinary things is it seems to me there's hardly a history of the invention of napalm.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a very complicated question. There are any number of answers. I'll give you one inadequate answer, but one that 20th century is the century of physics. The physicists were the glamour boys. Who is our symbol of 20th century genius? It's Einstein. That's not an accident. That we really felt that physics was the scientific discipline that promised us the future, right? It was physicists that brought us the nuclear age, who took us to the moon, who I could go on and on and on. So the atomic bomb was about the physicists and was caught up in the glamour of the physicists. And, the Manhattan Project was headed up by Robert Oppenheimer, who was this dashing, handsome, wealthy intellectual who had, grew up in an apartment in New York with Picasso's on the wall. Like, that's what physics was. Or physics was, was charming, cherubic Albert Einstein with his head of hair and his... napalm was invented by chemists. And chemists were the glamour boys of the 19th century, but not the 20th century. chemistry was already kind of falling out of fashion by the time these guys, they were, the physicists built for themselves a shrine in New Mexico at Los Alamos in order to do their work and spent billions of dollars on that project. The chemists were working out of, like, the chemist who invents napalm is working out of a basement laboratory in a dingy research hall at Harvard University. I mean, this is not glamour. With some guy, a research assistant who, just some random guy we hired. I mean, it's not, we're talking about something that was happening almost in the shadows. And I think that makes a difference. No one expected that something of consequence would come from the chemists. They did expect something of consequence to come from the physicists.
That's fascinating. That's a really fascinating answer. I wonder, this is a little moving away from the book, but thinking of the world we're living in right now, maybe coming out the other side of a global pandemic, but with so much work having been done to develop vaccines to combat the pandemic, I wonder if you think who the kind of glamour people, men and women, will be of the 21st century.
Oh, the biologists. I mean, it's already happened, right? Like, if you're a brilliant young science-oriented student today, choosing between chemistry, biology, and physics, you choose biology. I mean, no question. Whereas, to my point, 100 years ago you chose physics, and 200 years ago you'd have chosen chemistry. That's the kind of order of business now.
We have a question from Patrick Worthington, who says, is the point of bombing campaigns partly the targeting of critical strategic targets alongside punitive high collateral damage raids? So doesn't it speak to a need for payback, he asks? How much was the need for payback part of those campaigns?
I think that the head of the British bombing campaign in Second World War, Arthur Harris, was quite explicit about this, that he wanted to exact revenge for the Blitz, for the damage the Germans did too. And a lot of the bombing campaigns between the British and the Germans were this, they got trapped in this endless kind of cycle of vengeance. They were doing something because it had been done to them. They were not doing something because they were trying to hasten the ending of the war. I think it's fairly clear now that the war might well have ended sooner had the British not foolishly devoted so many resources to these very, very unproductive and morally dubious aerial bombing attacks on German cities. It did not. After the war, there's the famous bombing survey, which was this kind of post-mortem on, and the bombing survey was quite explicit in concluding that a lot of the bombs dropped on Germany had very little effect on German morale and did not speed the course of the war.
Well, and it's widely, I think, accepted. I'm speaking to you from London, where I've lived for many years. And in fact, I live in the East End of London, which was practically flattened during the Blitz. And that had pretty much the opposite effect on morale in this country.
Yes. One of the great mysteries, I talk about this in the book, one of the great mysteries of the British bombing campaign in Germany is why were they were pursuing a strategy against the Germans which had been pursued against them and hadn't worked. Right? So there's this weird thing where Germans bomb the British in the Blitz to destroy British morale. British morale is not destroyed. So what do the British do? Turn around and bomb German cities to destroy German morale. Well, why would, at one point, Bomber Harris, the question is put to him, why do you think the Germans would be affected by bombing and the British not? And his answer is, well, the British are made of sterner stuff, which is, as much as I am an Englishman and as much as I would like to believe that the English are superior in every way, it's preposterous to think then or now that somehow the British are made of sturdier stuff than the Germans.
I was going to say that does seem to be connected to the continuing story of the belief in British exceptionalism, but that's another conversation.
Yes.
Um, I'm curious as to how you do your well, actually, before I come to that, because we're talking about questions of morality, it's a really this is a really thrilling book to read. And you can feel the excitement of the people who were involved in this story. And it seems to me, to a certain extent, your own excitement, of course, in telling this thrilling story. But it's a different kind of story, perhaps, to ones you've told before. Were there challenges for you in working with this destructive material?
Uh, well, this book grows out of my podcasting interest as opposed to my writing interest. So this book was conceived first of all as a audiobook, and then the print book was a secondary production. Um, so I always had the sound in mind.
That's interesting.
And to me, I was telling a story. To my mind, I was telling a story whose emotional power was bound up in what you would hear: the voices of all these people, the sound of warfare, the sound of bombs dropping, the sound of Japanese survivors speaking, the sound of, and that is profoundly different from the way approach one would take to a print book. So it was different. Would I not intimidatingly different or anxiety producing different, interesting different? I mean, it's just another way to tell a story, and it's a way to tell a story that has, I think, a far greater emotional impact. And I've been doing that with my podcast for 5 seasons. So I was kind of already in that groove. So the podcast was a kind of rehearsal space for this kind of audiobook.